Welcome to the 79 Authors and Artists series, a new kind of crime family, a conversation with Rob Goldberg and Gary Krist. I'm your host, Bruce Peterson. Our authors will talk for an hour, followed by a half hour of Q&A. We will take your questions in writing using the Q&A function. You may also upvote questions using this function. If you'd like to, you may message other attendees using the chat function. Gary Krist is the best-selling author of 4 works of narrative nonfiction: The Mirage Factory, Empire of Sin, City of Scoundrels, and The White Cascade, as well as 5 works of fiction. He's also written for many publications, including the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, National Geographic Traveler, Esquire, GQ, and the Hudson Review, where he's been an advisory editor for over 20 years. He received the Sue Kaufman Prize from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, the Stephen Crane Award, a Lowell Thomas Gold Medal for Travel Journalism, and a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts. He was a National Endowment for the Humanities Public Scholar for 2020-21. Rob Goldberg is the former TV critic of the Wall Street Journal. He's also a writer-producer for dozens of documentaries. His work spans true crime stories for Vanity Fair Confidential and archaeological mysteries for National Geographic and Discovery. He's been nominated for multiple Emmys. This year, Rob's been working as a writer and producer on a couple of dramatic feature films and the I Was There series, which appears later this year on the History Channel. Recently, Rob co-authored The Hangman's Tale, the story of a French detective, Mazarel, on the trail of a serial killer. His father, Pulitzer Prize nominated author Gerald J. Goldberg, had introduced the detective in an earlier novel and had mapped out the plot and written a portion of the book before he became seriously ill and unable to continue writing. Rob teamed up with his family to finish the book before his father passed away, which brings us to today's discussion. I should add that Gary has also contributed a couple titles to the mystery thriller genre: Bad Chemistry in 1998 and Chaos Theory in 2000. We're thrilled to be able to join these 2 great authors for what promises to be a lively and informative discussion. Rob, Gary.
Thanks, Bruce.
Hey there.
Hey, Rob. You did a great job of introducing there. You stole some of my thunder, but I'll just say that, Rob and I have both done this before. So in order to avoid any repetition, we really are going to try to keep this focused on the mystery, both as a genre that both of us have contributed to, Rob in several different media, and talk about it as a little bit more of a general concept and maybe as a vehicle for discussions of more serious political and social issues. But I hope we'll also have time to make some recommendations of authors and series that we like and that some people listening like, because I found on my Facebook feed that that's something that people always are looking for, book recommendations. But the first book recommendation we want to make is this one. This is The Hangman's Tale, which is can't show that enough, which is the book that Rob wrote with his crime family, so to speak. And but as Bruce pointed out, this is actually part 2 of a series that your father started solo some years ago. And although Mazarel, who is one of these classic detectives, he's got idiosyncrasies, he's eccentric, he's got his weaknesses, but when he gets on the job, he gets it done. He's a wonderful, wonderful character, and I think he could take you through many, many books. But although in The Hangman's Tale, he's working in his native Paris, in the first book, he's actually in the Dordogne. And that's because the inspiration for that book and the whole series came from a real life incident in which 4 tourists were brutally murdered sometime in the 90s, right? So maybe you can tell us a little about your father's career and how he came upon this story and that sort of inspired him to write the Mazarel series.
Sure. Well, my dad was always a quote unquote serious novelist. And but it all started when we were on a vacation in the Dordogne. The whole family was there, and had this great little house in the town of Isigiac. And I guess it was my mom who's she's the real Francophile in the family. And the reason we all excuse me, we all learned to talk French, it's all because of my mom. So anyway, but she would be going through the local newspapers, and she was looking one day and found this murder story that had happened maybe like an hour from where we were staying, not all that far. And it was a very similar thing. It was a Dutch family on vacation in a house they had rented off in the countryside, and they were found murdered, and in a particularly gruesome way, bleeding out on the floor, the kitchen floor, actually in three different parts of the house. And most interestingly, it was the classic locked room kind of scenario. The doors, the whole farmhouse was locked. The doors, the windows were locked. So of course the question came up, how did this happen? What happened? And a worker on the property was hauled off to the police station. And there was footage of him being hauled off to the police station, kicking and screaming, saying, "You've got the wrong man. It's all, it's a big mistake." Anyway, a classic scenario. It inspired my dad. And so out of that, the first book, The Paris Directive, was born. And I think it also carries over into this book too. My dad always liked those scenarios of, the wrong man got, or woman in this case, man, got hauled off to jail for a crime he didn't commit,
Right.
So that was the starting point.
And the wrong man is often a foreigner, like an Algerian, or so that lets him get to those issues of nationalism, the rise of right-wing extremism in France.
100%. Yeah. I mean, and that's always because it's, who's a scapegoat, who's the usual suspects, who can they point a finger at? Right. And so that's the case in that first book. And in the second book, we went with the Gitan family, the what we call today Romani, which used to be called Gypsy, which a word we don't use anymore, but the Gitan family. And a similar kind of thing, somebody who's an easy scapegoat, railroaded into jail. And then of course, for somebody like Mazarel, that's a starting point. He's not going to stand for that. So
yeah. Well, let's talk about Mazarel a little bit, because he's such a vivid character. I mean, first of all, he's huge. He's I think in one of the books he was described as the equivalent of 6'3" and 265 pounds. That's a pretty big guy. I have to say, this may not be what you intended or anything like that, but I always saw a younger Gerard Depardieu in that role. But
I think my dad actually liked Depardieu, and I think
really?
That was one place he started from. He also has the big nose, the family nose that I inherited. The nose, in this case, the nose for food and the nose for crime. So.
And he has a very distinctive mustache, right? That everybody comments on the first time they see him.
Yeah. He's a big guy, sort of larger than, he's a big guy. He's a larger than life guy. He's a Falstaffian kind of character in a way.
Although that does not prevent him from getting the women, I noticed.
Well, no, right. He's not, I mean, he's got a charm to him. He's got a little, I think of my dad. I mean, it's funny, my dad, you talk to my mom, you talk to my dad, and they would both say, nothing like him. But I always thought it was a lot like him, it was, had a little twinkle in the eye, had a little, the half smile, which is like, yeah, I'm enjoying this, but the world isn't going to put one over on me kind of smile,
Well, in the first book, we get the sense that he's a little bit out of place because he's a Parisian, but he's down in the Dordogne because his young wife, who was dying, was from there, right? And so he went down with her, and after she died, he had to decide whether to come back to Paris. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, he gets. You're talking about at the end of the book and how it throws to the second book, basically.
Right.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, he solves a crime that's, he always was known as somebody who had an ability to figure out crimes that others couldn't, but to make sort of that imaginative leap to find, criminals or but he's not the easiest guy to get along with, Mazerel, right? And so he's been shunted off to the Dordogne by his superiors in Paris, who've kind of had enough of him. But after this case, which makes headlines, as in fact the real case did, it was all over the French news.
I think I vaguely remember it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was a big deal, and there's a lot of footage on the news. But anyway, after that, he gets called back to Paris, and reluctantly a little by his superiors, and he always has that kind of standoffish relationship with his bosses that he's just a piece of work.
And so now, it's like sightseeing a little bit. Now we're in Paris, and I guess the first murder is somebody shows up hanging upside down in a canal tunnel in the middle of Paris. Yeah. With a tarot card in his pocket. And so
and the body is hanging the same way as the tarot card, which is, it's not a lynching, it's not strung up by the neck. In fact, the body is strung up by the ankle, by the foot, upside down. My dad was fascinated with tarot cards and went on a long sort of investigation of tarot cards, and it turns out they sort of come out of from Italy, from medieval Italy, these pittura and fama. I don't remember the actual Italian, but basically there would be these little cards, and the justice system was very sketchy back then. But if you had somebody that you felt had committed a crime, or you were trying to put them on notice or whatever, you might be passing around this card, which is basically medieval slander or libel or whatever that would be, but it's like, it's this guy is a no good Nick, and we ought to put him away. And sometimes people would be hung up that way, upside down, and sometimes they would be dragged through the town behind a horse. Justice back then was a more, you just grab it and just administer it, and it wasn't such a the legal system had a long way to go, let's put it that way.
Now, so your father started this second book, but then became ill, and then I'm very intrigued by this idea of your whole family collaborating. I mean, I have always worked solo. The one collaboration I had was on a staged reading in 1982 in New York, and I just couldn't believe that I have to deal with the actors, I had to deal with the director and the set designer and stuff like that. And I said, I'm not doing this. I'm a solo guy. But so I'm very intrigued in how you work together, because it was your mother, yourself, and your son, 3 generations sort of stepped in. And what were the mechanics of that? How did that work?
So, I mean, you're totally right. I'm lucky or unlucky enough to have worked generally in the world of filmmaking, documentaries, fictional stuff too, and that's always about collaboration, right? You're always as you're saying, you're always working with a group of people, and you always have to I mean, there's something wonderful about any kind of collaboration, which is you get inspired. You've got an idea, somebody else hears it, they twist it away, and then it comes back to you in a way you never imagined. That's great. That's exciting. But we're collaborating with a family. It's a different kettle of fish, right?
Yes, I'm sure old tensions come up all the time.
Well, it's hilarious. Literally yesterday, I was just working with my son. We're working on a feature we just got commissioned to do, and got into a thing. And it's like, and he said, and he was absolutely right. He said, the thing about working together as a family is, you know each other so well. And that means you get on each other's nerves. It's like, oh, there he goes doing that thing again, whatever that thing is. But also it means you know each other so well, so you have a shorthand. You have a way of talking. You don't have to waste a lot of time. You can get right to the good stuff, which is wonderful, right? Which is just wonderful. Also, I was lucky enough that I'd worked with my dad before. We had teamed up on a couple of books, which I think I might have talked about in another one of these chats. But 2 books about the world of television generally, one of which was called Anchors, and it was about Dan Rather and Brokaw and Jennings, and then another book which was a biography of Ted Turner. So my dad and I worked together on those, and whenever you're teaming up to write, it's about making sure you are working, not just working well together, but what's on the page comes out with one voice, that it doesn't feel schizophrenic, that it doesn't feel like, okay, oh, that's that person and that's that person.
Right. I'm kind of interested in the mechanics of it. So did you like divide duties? Somebody would do most of the research, another person would think about plot, and somebody was responsible for the writing. Is that how it worked? No.
It could be, that could be a way you would do it, but the way we did it was, so James, my son, who had come out of USC Film School, and myself, doing documentaries, we started with the film production model, which was, we took the story. I mean, my dad had written a big chunk of it. Maybe he had written half, or maybe a little more. Some parts weren't exactly working, some parts were. And by the way, I should say, first and foremost, this all got started a few years back. My dad had a stroke, not a huge one, but a smaller one. But he had, for a brief moment, lost linguistic ability, which for a writer is, death. But then it started to come back. His memories started to come back. He was, a little medical aside, he was taking a drug called Ariset, which is, a memory booster. And all of a sudden, he started to have these memories from kindergarten. He could remember his kindergarten teacher, the people who sat next to him in class. It was incredible, just the things that started coming back, and his language started coming back. And as a writer, what he could do was he could focus really well on small scenes. But he couldn't keep an entire manuscript in his head at the same time. He couldn't keep the entire plot line in his head, but scene by scene, he could write them. So what ended up happening was that James and I, taking this production model, went back, we broke the story that existed down into the, cards, the famous, 3x5 cards. And then we started mapping out where the story needed to go, and the rest of the plotting, which my dad had a vague outline but not mapped out. So we mapped it out. Then we took all of that and we came back and we all met together, and my dad's still alive at the time, and my mom, and we laid it all out and we divided it up. And each of us would do some writing. My dad did some writing, my son did some writing, we all did some writing. And then, of course, anything that got written by one person got passed around to everybody else to, sand off the rough edges and make it all be a unified voice.
Yeah, it's amazing. There's no sense that this was like written by committee. It really has a single voice.
Thank you. Thank you. And we worked hard on that. We worked really hard. My dad also has a distinctive voice, it's a very, and so you can, it's like being an actor. You get into that person's voice, right? For another person. So, and I inherited so much from him anyway, but I found it easy to get into his voice. I mean, what he does really well, it's hard to do, as well as he did it, but metaphors, he just has a great ear for a metaphor. He can just, and his writing, reviewers in the Times and, other places would talk about how his writing sparkled. And it kind of does. It's very lively,
Although when we had lunch, I picked out some of my favorite turns of phrase, and they turned out to be your contributions.
Well, I was channeling him.
Well, there was another one that I really loved, the glass and chrome elevator that moved with the speed and smoothness of an electronic deposit. That was just very evocative.
That's him.
Oh, good.
That's him. Yeah. No, I mean, but he just has. He has writing that, you're reading along, and maybe a detective story, but you stop and you go, oh, that's a writer. Okay. So yeah, I mean, he was wonderful. I learned so much from him, really. Yeah.
And now he left some plans for a third Mazarel novel. Is that right?
That's right.
Going to take us to another part of France. So this is series can be like a tourist series.
Right. It's fun for us, right? Brittany and Normandy, and it's the idea of that Mazarel may have from when he was young and was a little bit even more of a ladies' man, may have a child that he never knew about, who all of a sudden shows up on his doorstep in Paris, and Mazarel's girlfriend from the time has died under mysterious circumstances, and so she wants him to come and help resolve that case. So that's a starting point. We've mapped out some other stuff, but
well, you gotta hurry, because the competition puts out a book a year, so you gotta. Some of these series, like actually, one thing that particularly the first book the Paris Directive reminded me of is the Martin Walker Bruno Chief of Police series, which takes place in the same area. And I was very surprised that you had not read.
I didn't know those books. Later people had told me about them, and I know my dad was not a huge mystery reader, as it turns out, but and I don't think he made that distinction so much between here's mystery books and here's other books. It's just like it's writing.
Right.
But that said, no, he didn't know. I mean, the authors I know who are European or whatever don't exactly match. I guess the closest match would be Donna Leon, if you know her.
Right.
He does the ones out of Venice,
Right. Yeah.
But no, however, I think, before we go any further on the mystery thing, I think we got to turn it around and start talking about a couple of your mysteries.
That's ancient history.
But good ancient history. I guess one thing that was interesting to me was, reading Chaos Theory, which is a great read. It was just like, woof, I think I told you I read it in a day, boom. But one thing I liked, and here's a point of overlap for us, I think, was that it was how social commentary worked its way into the story. I mean, the story is a story of some teenagers who on a lark go for a drug buy in the wrong part of town and find themselves caught up in a whole other situation. And I love, by the way, I'm a fan of that sort of, what do you call it? The average guy who gets into a situation that's over his head or her head. It's sort of the Hitchcocky.
The Wrong Man, I think.
Wrong Man. I mean, it's like North by Northwest, yeah. So, but I want to talk about the social commentary aspect, because you were using that as a jumping off point for, I guess you were living and working, in Maryland, but basically DC at the time.
Right,
and DC was sort of in shambles, and you used that for social commentary. Tell me
Right.
about that, you know?
It was the 90s, and Marion Barry was back as mayor after the famous crack bust thing. And the city was just not in great shape. And although compared to today, it doesn't seem quite as bad as it was, but there was real income inequality and homelessness problem, all these things that are coming back in spades now. And so I was really interested and appalled by the haves versus the have-nots in this the capital of the most powerful nation in the world. And so the central, I don't want to spill the beans too much, but the central thing that's going on, the scam that's going on in town, is a very cynical manipulation of the worth of the haves versus the have-nots, and that the have-nots are expendable to be at the service of the haves. And these two smart high school kids get involved in this. And to tell you the truth, this was 23 years ago that I wrote this. I haven't read it again since. So you probably know the book a lot better than I do. But
I know it's funny. That is a funny thing, which is like when you write for a living and you've written a lot of stuff, it's like, I got to go back and read it again because other people remember it better than you do. So maybe it's just a sign of age, but
I have to say that, I originally started, I wrote 2 mystery thrillers, I guess you'd call them. And I originally started because we were living in the New York area, and my wife, Elizabeth, whom some of you know, got a job with National Geographic. And if you're a photo editor, you don't say no to the National Geographic. So although I was not that high on DC at the time, we moved down there. And so I said, well, my first 2 books had been literary short stories that sold like 8,000 copies each. Sort of said, if I'm going to make a living, I've got to do something else. And so I kind of cynically said, all right, I'll write a thriller. But I have to say that, like your father, once I got into the genre, I found that, it doesn't have to be schlocky, it can be really good. So, I tried to make it my best. That was Bad Chemistry, which came out in 98. And it was about a kind of an ex-cop, a woman, Kate Baker was her name, very working class. And I was also playing with class issues that, that I felt that I experienced. She was a sort of a working class woman who had, after her cop years, had been thrown. She married a wealthy man and been thrown into sort of a different class, and didn't quite feel comfortable with it. So there were some social issues there, and I'd like to talk a little bit about like the research involved in this. Like, to write the 2 thrillers that I did write, I took 2 Citizens Police Academy courses to learn about police work. And that was in the 90s. There was this big community policing initiative where they would give willing members of the community an opportunity to take sort of a scaled down version of police academy, what the police officers go through. So we would go, we would, shoot guns in various places. We would have to make decisions of, shoot or not shoot and stuff like that. And I actually became very friendly with the police chief of the city of Rockville in Maryland. And he was very helpful. And I sent him the book. I thought I was being fair to police. I was perhaps a little bit skeptical of some of the characters in the book, and I think he was furious.
Oh, really?
So I mean, that's another thing in what we do. It's like you've got to.
You're always pissing somebody off.
You have to get cooperation from people. You maybe don't tell them that you're going to be criticizing them, and
and I mean, it's not that you're doing it necessarily in bad faith.
Right.
You're it's just also maybe you see things from a little more a slight bit of distance and a little more objectively than they might see themselves. It's possible, so you might have a little more distance. Yeah, it's great. I mean, that kind of being able to do that sort of research, I have to say is one thing that I love. I mean, I get to do it more with documentary stuff, but it's something I just love. I've never gone out and shot guns. That's impressive. I mean, that level of hands-on.
Controlled environment, and they were fitted with lasers, I think. Well, there was a shooting range where we shot actual ammunition, but they will put you in this room with a pistol that has a laser attached to it, and a scene plays out on a screen in front of you, and you have to decide, are
Shoot
you
or don't
really in
shoot.
danger, shoot or not shoot? Yeah, and that was
Oh wow,
eye-opening.
That really is. I mean, the closest thing I've done to that, I've done a bunch of, on the documentary front, a bunch of stuff with on terrorism, and so I've had the chance. I did a short limited series for History Channel called The New Age of Terror, and went out. I mean, was all over the map, but went out with the NYPD also, their counterterrorism unit on New Year's Eve.
Oh God.
This was just after ISIS had hit in Paris, and so New Year's Eve, Times Square. And we were up with the counterterror unit, the sniper squad, which is supposed to be the anti-sniper squad, but they're up there with their sniper rifles, training, on the crowd, just keeping an eye out for bad guys. And it's just, anytime like that, you go behind the scenes and you see what's going on. It's just.
Well, let's talk more about your documentary and TV work, because I mean, a lot of what you do is mystery based. And sometimes you start a project and you don't really know what you're going to find, right? Like that King Tut. Since you're there as it's happening, it could turn out to be a total bust, like Geraldo and what was it, Al Capone's vault?
Yeah, the famous.
There was nothing in Al Capone's vault. You always run that danger. So I guess there are times where you kind of know the ending, and other times where you don't know the ending.
Right. Well, you start out, documentaries, because you have to go out and shoot. So you're going to be spending a bunch of money on other stuff. Sorry, popular. Because you're, you've got to mobilize a team of people, right? And so you can't go willy-nilly and just hope for the best. So you have to map out the way you think the story is going to unroll. On the other hand, the way it actually unrolls when you're out in the field may turn out to be different, and you have to be open to that. Mm-hmm. So the King Tut one you mentioned is interesting, because we were going out trying to find out how King Tut had died. I mean, first of all, our team, which was very cool, was we got to DNA scan King Tut, which is the only time it's really been done. And we were trying to figure out who his family was. And part of that is, this is a long archaeology story, but anyway, his parents Akhenaten and the question was Nefertiti his mother, or was she his stepmother? Looks like his stepmother. But Tut, dies young. He dies at the age of probably around 19 or so. And when you start doing these sort of CSI type investigations, right, where you're in there, you're doing CAT scans, where you're creating a digital pharaoh, right, like thousands of little slices, and putting it together into this digital pharaoh. Things start to pop up, like, okay, he had a leg break, his shin was broken, his leg was snapped, and you can tell that it wasn't after he died. It wasn't to the mummy. It was before he died, because there was a little bit of growth where it started to heal, basically. So you could tell it happened before he died, just the faintest little bit of it, you know. So that was one thing that was interesting. We also found that he had Marfan syndrome, which is, you know, when the head is a little elongated. His father, Akhenaten, absolutely had it, where the hands are like 4/5 the size of the arm. You know, the hands are really, you know, elongated. And so anyway, with this leg crack, you know, the question was, did he die? Because there are hieroglyphs that show him leading troops into battle. So, and at Kadesh, you know, which battles in North Africa. So the question was, did he die in battle? Well, went looking for other wounds. We discovered in the back of his head, basically a hole in the back of his head. So, you know, is it possible that he was either died to the blow in battle or was murdered? You know, could that have been possible? But then the closer we looked at it, it turned out it was a very, you know, like a perfect circle, not a blow. And it became clear that it was, in fact, the embalmers, after he died, had cut a hole in the skull to embalm the skull and pour resin in, which they do. But we found there were two types of resin, one which was done hastily and one which was done less hastily, you know? So maybe he died out in the field and was brought back home. Anyway,
it's like, I mean, it's like being a detective 3,000 years later, you know?
Right. So it's when people talk about cold cases, these really are cold cases.
So that was a part of a series called Cold Cases. That was in the early 2000s. And what channel was that for? Or?
I mean, there was a bunch of different ones. I worked on some, but there was Forensic Files, there was Cold Case. A&E had some of them. Then A&E also went into 48 Hours. I worked on the progenitor of that. There was just a lot. I worked on a series for TLC called True Cases from the Morgue, which was following I think it was the Nashville Medical Examiner with his case. You know, it became a thing for a while, you know, going and the CSI approach, basically. And there's a lot of stories. I will say, without, you know, giving anything away, that in the Tut case, we also discovered that he had malaria, and a particularly deadly form of malaria. So was he killed in battle? Was it malaria? Was it, you know, the guy was a mess. He had, and a deformed foot, by the way. So like, because of inbreeding, you know, where they intermarried. He married his stepsister, I guess it would be, well, anyway, but the point being, you know, it's totally inbred. His wife was his stepsister. I guess that's right. Yeah. Yeah. So.
And you've done some Inca stories too, right?
Right. So yeah, so this one is a shout out to another classmate of ours, Tom De La Cal, who was my roommate for a chunk of Princeton. He had always up on all things, you know, Spanish, Latin America, and had come across a story of some archaeologists who thought they had found the lost city of Vilcabamba. And Vilcabamba is, well, everybody knows Machu Picchu. It was what Hiram Bingham was looking for when he found Machu Picchu, but Vilcabamba was supposed to be this glorious golden city up in the Andes, which I believe still is out there somewhere. Yeah, we didn't find it in the end. It was
so it was Al Capone's vault.
Well, not quite. It was a little better than that. We found Inca structures, but instead of being this lost Inca city, it was more like, you know, the Inca garden shed and a couple of Inca outhouses, you know. But wow, that was an amazing adventure. Tom was there too, as another one of the producers, and we were up in the cloud forests of the Andes, and encountering tarantulas that were, well, literally the size of your hand. But also it was the one time where I felt like I almost died. We were in a helicopter, and one thing people may not know about helicopters, right? The way they work, the rotors, is that you need air resistance, right? But the higher up you go, the thinner the air is, right? They talk about oxygen deprivation. It's because the air is thinner higher up. Well, to go into the Andes, you're coming out of Cusco, which is already like 11, 12,000 feet, right? And so, and we were going down this valley, and our team with all the stuff had gone out on mules actually out ahead of us, and were clearing a landing spot in the middle of this valley, which was like basically all trees. You couldn't land anywhere. It's like all trees. Anyway, we go down the this valley, and all of a sudden, it's not called the cloud forest for nothing. The clouds start rolling in. Our pilot is looking at the gas gauge, and we're already like an hour out of Cusco, and we don't have enough gas to get back. We were planning, we were planning to, make it there, and then he was going to continue over the hills, but we're, the clouds are coming in. You can't go over the mountains, because if you go over the mountains, the air is too thin and the helicopter will crash. You can't land because the helicopter will crash. The clouds are coming in, and this was not a fancy schmancy helicopter. This was just a functional one. It didn't have that, it had a very rudimentary kind of radar, but not good enough to, And the pilot looked over at me, which I will never forget. He looks over at me and he goes, and he just shook his head, and that's as scared as I've ever been. It was, we were lucky,
and you survived. So
I'm here. We were lucky. We kept going, and we caught a glimpse of a little clearing, and it was our clearing, and we did manage to land. And but if not, the class of '79 might have been minus both me and Tom, who was in that helicopter as well. But he was in the back. I was sitting in the front with the pilot. I don't think he even noticed what the pilot was saying. It was scary as hell.
So you've been to these, far-flung places, but there was also a story in the town that we both live in, Jersey City, right?
Right.
That was a long time. I just found out about this incident. It's interesting because like nowadays Jersey City is so heavily Asian, and this was back when Asian population was just starting to grow in Jersey City. And there's these series of, were they actually murders or just attacks?
They were attacks, but there was, I think, also 1 or 2 murders as well in the span of it. They were targeting Indians, Asian Indians, of which Jersey City has back then and still has a big population, right? And the cases became known as the dot buster cases because of the Bindi, right? Called dot busters. That's what these people, and it's not so dissimilar from what we get into in the Hangman's Tale, which is it's just easy to scapegoat immigrant communities. It's just sad but true. It's just easy to scapegoat these folks. So in this particular case, there was a series of random brutal beatings of these Indian folks. I was out of New York at the time, had never been to Jersey City, been to Princeton, Jersey City was something, you took the train from Princeton to New York, you never stopped in between or and this would have been in the 80s, late 80s, I guess. So yeah, mid to late 80s. And I gotta say, I was a little freaked out going to Jersey City. There were parts of town that were not the best. There was, it was a little run down. It was a little, and then going to these places where people had been beaten and in one or two cases there had been murders. Yeah, it was.
Now, was this a print journalism?
This was print. Yeah, this was a
print.
story for New Jersey Monthly.
Uh-huh.
I wrote that one for New Jersey Monthly. Yeah, I mean, it's just weird. I think I talked about it in the other case, just being a freelancer. Sometimes you're going out for National Geographic and you're doing something and everybody wants to talk to you. And I mean, I remember filming. It was one of the few times I actually took my son James with me on a thing. We were doing a thing of the Secrets of Florence, and we're in the Duomo, and we're filming inside the Duomo, and people are coming up to us and they're like. And they even came up to my son. That's, because he told me afterwards, who is this for? Oh my God, National Geographic. It's so amazing. It's so incredible, And meanwhile, other times you're going out and you're reporting a story for New Jersey Monthly. And it's like, yeah, okay,
Yeah. Sometimes hard to get cooperation. Yeah.
People are not as interested.
Yeah.
Let's put it that way. Yeah. And in this particular case, the reason for the beatings was there was a lot of anti-Indian sentiment among part of the blue-collar neighborhoods where the neighborhoods bordered each other, because they had this mistaken idea that these newcomers were taking their jobs, were taking the low-income jobs. In fact, the more I looked into it, not the case at all. These were jobs that, the blue collar folks who lived in Jersey City didn't even want, they wouldn't show up to interview for or to put in their, not a resume, to even just, fill out an application. They weren't interested. Yet they resented this population coming in and taking their jobs, right? It was sad. The whole thing was just really, so there was just a lot of anger on all sides.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sort of what the backdrop of France, in the Mazarelle novels.
Exactly.
The
population from North Africa coming over from yeah,
right,
exactly.
Yeah.
So, it's just, what can you say? It's just people, I don't even know where to go with that. It's just really sad. Yeah.
Well, I was just thinking, I'm out here in San Francisco right now, just doing a little bit of book researching. And even the stuff I'm writing now, I'm writing narrative nonfiction. I feel a little bit like a detective. Just yesterday, I was at the California Historical Society Library. And this guy I'm writing about, this 19th century lawyer who was a 49er who came to California early on, was eventually murdered by his longtime adulterous lover. And he was just prominent enough. He was not that famous, but he was prominent enough that his letters are scattered all around. I spent 2 weeks in Michigan with most of his letters last fall. But there was a cache of letters in the California Historical Society that I hadn't seen before. And while I was looking at them, there was this other file that I found, which was the police chief of San Francisco had the notes that he had taken on the murder of this guy that I'm writing about.
And that was still in the file.
And it was still in the file.
Wow.
And
How cool.
I learned I've been studying this guy for 2 years. And I learned this amazing new thing about him, that, although his lover got off ultimately on a temporary insanity plea, she had actually tried to kill him before. And this never came up in the trial and stuff like that. And to my knowledge, maybe people haven't seen this document, but I saw this letter that had credible evidence that she had hired 2 guys to knock him off. And they told him about it because he was a prominent person, and he said, "Oh, don't do anything about it. I'm going to go talk to her." And apparently, he talked her down. She was very volatile.
Once.
Yes, yes. But then, he kept on saying that he was going to divorce his wife and marry her, and for 7 years he kept on putting her off. So I think at a certain point, there were numerous periods in that 7-year period when she said, "Forget it, he's not going to do it." He would talk her down, and finally he couldn't talk her down, and she basically shot him in the chest on the Oakland San Francisco ferry. And I'm using this story to talk about the early history of San Francisco, but it's like mystery is everywhere. Detectives are everywhere in the stories themselves, and just by writing the stories, you're acting.
And in the sheer writing of the story, being a journalist or being a historian or being a detective, because what is being a detective? It's going out and putting together a story, the narrative of what happened, by talking to people, which is what a journalist or a historian does, and by going to the places and see, so basically it's all detective work.
Yeah. Everything's a mystery, and it's like I keep on thinking of the line from Hamlet that the times are out of joint, oh cursed spite that I was ever born to set it right. It's either the protagonist or the detective who is the one who is born to set it right. Something has gone wrong, and it's got to be made whole again. And that's a powerful story arc, and I think it carries over into everything we've done.
And I wanted to point out, just because I was flipping through a little of A City of Scoundrels, your nonfiction stuff, besides the San Francisco one, the kinds of characters that show up in these histories or whatever are also mystery kinds of characters. You had this Big Bill Thompson, who's, they're scoundrels, they're con men. You had a kidnapping of a little girl, also not by him, but mystery is everywhere. But this kind of character, this kind of scoundrels and con men, right? I mean, they're great. I thought this Big Bill Thompson was
he was a gift to any narrative historian. He was just so colorful and so corrupt, but he was beloved among certain parts of the population. The reformers didn't like him, but the reformers were evil in their own way. He was much better on race than the reformers were. So one of the themes of that book is that the reformers got to write history, but sometimes it's a lot more complicated, and it's not so easy to tell the good guys from the bad guys in history.
Right, and it's that sense of, which is at the heart of mystery, where you think somebody is a bad guy and they actually turn out to be a good guy, or you think somebody's a good guy and they turn out to be a bad guy, or that's it's the reversal. It's the narrative twist. And especially when you get into history, but hopefully in good fiction, the people that you think, we spent a lot of time in Hangman's Tale setting up things that you think are one way, but turn out to be a very different way. If it works, that's the heart of mystery, right? So
right, yeah. Now, when we were thinking of like what mystery writers have influenced us, and my impression was that I didn't read that many mysteries or thrillers, but when I actually went and started thinking about it and Googling lists and stuff like that, I've actually read quite a few, and maybe we can just finish by mentioning some of the ones that have been significant for us.
Who do you like?
People are really, they love to know what to read next. What's a good bet to read next? I love, as I said, those Martin Walker mysteries, which I would recommend very highly, because it's the mysteries themselves are not that good in terms of plot. They're okay, but it's really all about the meals, the wine, the whole lifestyle of the Dordogne, which we've both been there, and
It's
we know
great.
what it's like, and it's just like life's got to be that way. So I think that there are these series that they're almost, they introduce you to a culture or something like that, and I was really very fond of Tony Hillerman, who wrote the Navajo series
Yeah,
back
he's good.
then. But how about you?
Oh, geez. So many. So I love, on the European side, I really like Philip Kerr, Kerr, who has a detective, Bernie Gunther, who
In
is
Berlin, is that
in Berlin. And
right?
it's the great setup for those stories is he's a homicide detective from between the wars, but then going into World War II. But he's a homicide detective in Berlin at the time the Nazis are operating and killing people right, left, and center, the SS, So how can you possibly be a homicide detective in Berlin during World War II? And yet there are serial killers operating there, and it's his job to, but he keeps intersecting with politics because, of course, oh, and the other thing is he's not a Nazi himself. They keep trying to get him to join the Nazi party and he refuses. So anyway, but those stories are great. I love Michael Connolly, who's great. A guy started out as a reporter writing on the LA crime beat, and then came up with his character Harry Bosch,
who like Mazzarell is a big jazz fan.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have to say though, with Connolly, almost more than the Bosch series, I like the Lincoln Lawyer series, the Mickey Haller series.
Those are great too.
They're half brothers, but yeah.
And I like sometimes they intersect too. For a few books, they intersect. Yeah, but I don't know. Something about Bosch. I mean, he's it's just clearly a crime reporter who's been out with the sort of jaded detectives, world weary detectives. And that's also with Mazzarell, there's a little bit of that world weary thing, because that's a hard job, it's just confronting terrible things every day. Anyway, Connolly, I'm trying to think who else. I mean, I should probably just look over my shoulder. There's a ton of, but I guess, I like Robert Krist. I like Elvis Cole, his detective, Joe Pike, the other guy. There's a million. Anyway, we could go on forever, but maybe we should, I guess we're getting over to question time. Is that?
Here I am. Yeah, thanks. Thanks for that. That was a lot of fun. You actually answered our first question. You anticipated the first question. We got Peggy Russell said, thanks for doing the program, and for Gary in the Pacific time zone too.
Yes, I'm operating on 1 cup of coffee. I want you to know.
She had asked about, she was eager to hear about some of your favorite mysteries. So you anticipated her question. So we'll move. Nancy Harkness asks, she said, I might have missed this because my doorbell rang, but did they ever find the killer in the real Dordogne murders? Was it the first person they arrested?
So the story on that, it's interesting. The story on that was that they arrested the handyman, who was, I think, of Algerian descent. As I said, dragged him off, kicking and screaming, to jail. And he died in jail. Is that right? He died in the book, he dies in jail. And I think in reality, in one case, he commits suicide. And in one case, wow, I'm driving. It's been a lot of years, but I believe anyway. He was considered the guy who did it. The one thing they had on him was that he had the cash cards of the people who had died, and he went and tried to make cash withdrawals from the bank with the cash cards of the people who had been killed. He always claimed that he didn't do the murder. He came upon it later and just took the cash cards, and it was just a robbery, but he wasn't the murderer. You know, I say go out and investigate it some more, but you know, it looked like he had done it. I don't know.
Nancy asks another question. Another of our authors, Nancy, said, I've started adding in suspense elements to my romance novels, so I'm interested in how you plot. Do you know who done it right from the start, or do you set up multiple possible villains and see who gets to be the murderer as you get closer to the end?
Well, you want to go first, Gary?
All right, yeah. When I started, the distinction between mysteries and thrillers is one that's never been entirely clear. I always think that in a mystery, the whodunit aspect is the most important. In a thriller, it's just, the time is out of joint and somebody's got to set it right. My first novel was Bad Chemistry. And there I was just, I knew that something was going on, and I just said, it'll work out in the end, and of course, there's a certain advantage to that kind of spontaneity, particularly, I think that's how most literary novels are written. That's how I wrote most of my short stories. But in a thriller or a mystery, especially in a mystery, I think you have to know a little bit more. And, I found in writing that first book, it was my first time writing a novel, that I wrote myself into a corner a number of times by using this spontaneous technique. So I wasted a lot of time sort of backtracking and erasing and going forward. But it has always amazed me how a solution presents itself to you eventually if you're just making it up as you go along. But now, writing nonfiction, I sort of know how everything ends. So it's just a matter of shaping the story to get there.
I would say that when it comes to mysteries and thrillers, an outline is your best friend, right? That doesn't mean you necessarily have to map out everything and you're just painting by numbers as you go. It's that if you know where you're heading, you can add in a lot more interesting detours and do some of what Gary's saying. But you want to know, in both of the Mazarel books, we've known who the killer is in advance. There are different ways of structuring mysteries. The first one my dad did, which I wasn't part of, but he set up the killer as this great character from the beginning, and it's one of those Day of the Jackal kind of things where you've got the people tracking the killer, you've got the killer, you've got two narrative lines going, and the question is not who done it, but the question is, will the detective catch up with this person and in time to save other people and how? It's I think one thing that's super interesting, I did a piece for Vanity Fair Confidential, which was called Don't Ask, Don't Kill. It was about a soldier who had been bludgeoned to death in the barracks of Fort Campbell, I think, in Kentucky, bludgeoned to death. And they knew right away who the killer was. It was another soldier who had beaten him to death, with a baseball bat. But the mystery wasn't who done it. It was why done it. There are a lot of different ways you can go about it. In this particular case, it was it a gay bashing kind of thing? Well, the guy who was killed didn't consider himself gay. But anyway, it's a long story. But the why became very interesting. What was the motive for this particular person wielding the baseball bat, and why was he doing it? that can be a very satisfying mystery. The how done it can be very satisfying. And as in the Day of the Jackal, scenario and the Paris Directive, just following the two stories and wondering how the detective is going to solve the case, is also satisfying. So I guess the point is you can outline something basically and get to it a lot of different ways as you go.
Got it. We got another question from Peggy. She says, now I have a more typical Peggy question. Do you think that changes in attitudes about gender, race, sexual orientation, et cetera, have influenced the way you write your mysteries? If so, how?
Oh, sure. I mean, just up to the point where this last book has to go through a pass from what is it called? A reader, a something reader. What's it called? Basically a sensitivity reader. And I thought we were being super sensitive as we went along, and the sensitivity reader is being even more careful. There were things like the Gitan family, right? The Romani family, but the use of the word gypsy, which people might think is sort of romantic or whatever, in that community is considered a slur, basically like the N-word or whatever. It's considered really, really bad. Well, that's an eye-opening kind of thing. That was not something I was doing, but my dad, was from a generation before, he was just laying it all out there, and it was like going through and taking out all the gypsies except for villains and scoundrels can use a slur, but other people can't. So on the other hand, as we were saying, the heart of the treatment of the immigrant community was built into the narrative of this story. So right from the beginning, we were absolutely looking at the way people from different ethnic backgrounds are being treated. In France, they're just terrible stories of beatings and killers and killings. And part of this we haven't talked about, but is white nationalism. That's a part of the narrative of this story. Mazarel goes and investigates this group of white nationalists who look to be involved in this killing. So I guess, Peggy, the short answer is, yeah, absolutely. That's all part of the story for sure.
I think for me, I haven't written mysteries in a while, but with the current work I'm doing is, as a historian, you got to really get it through your head that there are certain people who leave more evidence than other people, and it's usually the marginalized people who leave less. So you've got to work much harder to get that information than the sort of approved version that is put out by the white establishment. So in the San Francisco book, that's kind of one of the themes of the thing, how certain elements of the population of San Francisco, for instance, San Francisco in the beginning was a very loose place where there was a lot of gender boundary crossing, racial boundary crossing, and things like that. But as the city matured, it was believed that in order to be a respectable place, there have to be these hierarchies. And so people were marginalized, African Americans were marginalized, the Chinese were marginalized, this whole cross-dressing culture that kind of existed in San Francisco had to be marginalized. And finding evidence of what was actually going on in those communities is much harder than finding out what the white mayors were doing. So it is sort of changed my just the amount of time I have to spend seeking out different kinds of information, because it's always the establishment that has its information right there in the books to give you, but you've got to dig a little harder to find out the story of the other people.
Yeah. I had a question about, you talked about the how the detective solves the mystery, or how the mystery is solved. And I guess comparing true crime with fiction, do you think that the fiction fiction that you've written or others have written reflects the reality of the how and the how something is solved or the how a mystery is resolved? Or do you think it's freer to be more interesting than the reality, I guess?
Each case is just different. Some cases are, they're a true crime, the classic stranger than fiction. I've worked on some true crime that just, it's hard to believe. A little overlap with Gary's story, but the story of the murder of a woman named Bonnie Lee Bakley, who was the wife briefly of Robert Blake, if you remember Robert Blake from Beretta fame and other stuff. And those kind of cases, literally he had hired various people to kill her. She was an awesome con woman character herself, but they had an affair. She had assured him she was on the pill. Turns out the pill she was on was a fertility pill, not and so presents him with a baby, and he doesn't want any part of it, and somehow she pressures him into this marriage that he's not really into, for the baby. But he's a dark character, Robert Blake, and very quickly starts hiring various people to maybe murder her, and the potential murders fall through at various points. Anyway, without going into all the details, and she ends up shot to death outside a restaurant in the valley. And Robert Blake is accused of the murder, and a jury of his peers acquits him. He's found not guilty, but then the family hauls him back in front of the jury again for not a criminal case, but a civil case. They sue him, and in the civil case, they win. He's has to come up with money because he has been found to be behind the killing. To this day, one jury finds him guilty, one jury finds him not guilty. What really happened, But these kind of cases are just, mind-blowing. And you think when you go out for these true crime cases, so many of them, the characters are great, and often, even better than you could come up with, I can go on and tell other stories. If we have time, I will later, but get to the other questions and then we can circle back.
Yeah. I guess one question that we had was, did you, in completing the book, did you travel to France and do more research as a family in completing the book?
So the short answer is, went back to France a lot. Did we go with my dad? I went back and did more stuff. But obviously we had the pandemic hit right in the middle of this, and so we weren't traveling anywhere. We weren't going outside our front door. So there was one trip to France a little before, to Paris. But listen, as I'm sure some of the folks watching know, I was lucky enough to live in France a few times, and so I have a lifetime of research on Paris that some of my fondest memories. So anyway.
Got it. How important is it to place locations and landmarks that people will recognize when you're writing fiction?
So I think it's fun for people. I don't think, you have to do like, it's a mile from the Eiffel Tower as he goes down the street, I don't think anybody cares. I think what people care about are, oh, well, here's one thing that got cut out of the book. It was like a chapter that was, things always get left on the cutting room floor, but things that, like in Paris, there's a playing card museum where they have tarot cards that go back to the medieval ages, and they have these, early tarot cards and early playing cards, and you can find it online. It's just this incredible playing card museum, and I had a great time writing that chapter, and then never even made it into the book. So, but sure, I mean, I think what's more fun is not the Champs-Elysees or the, whatever. It's the parts of the city you thought you knew, but here's seeing it in a different way. Here's you've taken the tour boat on the Canal Saint-Martin, but here's a body dangling from in the tunnel, anyway, whatever. It's seeing it something you thought you knew in a different way.
Well, I also have to say that when I was reading, I guess it was in the second book, when Mazarel takes a trip down to Marseille, and he does the interviews he has to do, and he says, I still have time before my train back. I'm going to go to Chez Remy restaurant. And he sits down and has this wonderful fish soup. Was it bouillabaisse?
Bouillabaisse.
Yeah. And so, of course, instantly I closed the book and I went on to Google, because we're going to be in Marseille later this year, I hope. And I was like, I want to eat where Mazarel ate. And unfortunately, it was fictional. So
it was an amalgam of a few things. That was my dad. I mean, and I have to say, speaking of some of these other authors, my dad was really into the food stuff. So in the first book, especially Paris Directive, there's a lot of foodie,
right.
Because as you say, the Dordogne is foie gras and mushrooms and walnuts, and anyway, it's all of that stuff. But Chez Remy, I think, is an amalgam of a couple of restaurants. And it's really fun if you go back and do a little research into the bouillabaisse, the history of the bouillabaisse, because there were a bunch of restaurants all claiming that they made the original bouillabaisse. And a few of the restaurants got together, and it became this sort of battle over who had the original bouillabaisse. And a few restaurants got together and they came up with the recipe that they claimed is the official bouillabaisse. But if you go in the New York Times thing, they say on a recent article, they claim that the best bouillabaisse is in fact not in Marseille at all. It's around the coast. If you go like 45 minutes down the coast to this little place where they make the best bouillabaisse, it's like one of those things, like who's got the best Thanksgiving turkey, or I don't know what the best, whatever. It's like, everybody claims they have the original,
Right.
Got it. Any plans to try and turn this into a movie or Netflix series?
As of this exact moment, it's out with our agent, who is flogging it around town. So fingers are crossed. We'll see.
I guess just as a series, would the two books you have be the series, or would you be needing to write additional mysteries for the character?
It's an interesting thing how things get adapted, and seeing as actually we just got hired to adapt another book recently, I'm sort of very up on the mechanics of it. But the two ways you can go are, the Bosch way is that each book, well, it takes like a book and a half, basically, is a series, is a season. I guess you'd call it a season. So one book becomes a 10-part thing, so they break it down that way. Other folks will make multiple stories. In our case, because there's two and with a third, I would bet it will probably be the Bosch model, but I think that there are other models where literally, I think it's less interesting when sort of the Law and Order model where, every episode is one crime story, and it's all really about the mechanics of the crime and solving the crime. And I think there's a lot more there, because we are getting into police corruption, we are getting into white nationalism. There's just a lot more going on, I think.
Right. Gary, I don't know if you do any of your narrative nonfiction works lend themselves to
well, they've all been optioned, and it's gotten to the point where I'm talking with the producers and we're talking about credits and stuff like that, and what we're going to do, and hiring the showrunners, and then nothing happens. So it's Hollywood, dealing with Hollywood is very difficult. What the things that ultimately get greenlit and the things that don't, I just have not been able to figure it out, and my movie agent has not been able to figure it out either. But I do remember talking with a producer who's Warren Littlefield. Yeah, Warren Littlefield. Thank you. My researcher is here. Basically, he said, your book, since I'm writing nonfiction, there's a certain straitjacket that you have to put on. But he said, the material in your book will be good for 2 seasons, but after the 2nd season, we're just going to run with it. And so I think that, once the writers get the characters, they will take it off in their own direction. And I think most of us original writers would have no say in that beyond a certain point.
I guess Deadwood was a real place, but I think the characters are quite fictionalized. Real place with real people that appear in it, but they don't appear as they really were necessarily.
Right.
George Hurst and some of these guys. Yeah. One back to the Hangman's Tale. One question was, Rob, you had mentioned that your dad did a lot of research on tarot cards. Were there any points where you and your family stopped and said, gee, we need to do some research on this, and what were they?
Well, it's interesting what you're talking about, little details you pick from your own life, or what things you get fascinated by and go down the rabbit hole on the internet, and all of us, by the way, being old enough that we might remember, well, if you were a journalist, you might remember calling the New York Public Library information desk, having to get information. And now having the internet, it's mind-blowing how useful, how much research you can do. But just to give 2 examples of things, one which was not a research thing. Well, I'll start with the research one. There's one chapter which was literally the first thing I wrote in my portion that I did, which was encountering the locksmith, which came from a story from my dad, who got locked out of, he had borrowed his my grandfather's car, and left the key in the car and got locked out. And some guy came along and had a coat and pulled it open and had all these keys, and was like, oh, could it be this one? Could it be that one? And he let my dad in. It's a story of family legend. But getting into, the kinds of keys, the paracentrics, the double-siders, the fiche, which are like H-shaped, and how you would pick that kind of lock, and how you would, that kind of thing. You go off down those rabbit holes, which are great fun. But sometimes you have stuff that just comes out of your life, which is, we had this wonderful dog, since gone, but Bernese Mountain Dog. And I used to take him for walks. Rufus used to take him for walks. And he had one of these leashes that I'm sure those of you who've had dogs would have, which are those extendo leashes, the long line. And I just remember going out with him, and he'd get out there and you'd try to pull him back. And he's Bernese Mountain Dogs. They're big, strong dogs. And trying to pull him back, and this thin line, and it would get wrapped around stuff. And at one point it was like, that would be a great thing in a murder mystery, to have somebody strangled by one of those leashes, So it just came out of walking the dog.
Good. I know you've both talked extensively about things that you've talked about. Gary, you've talked about your research in San Francisco, and Rob, you've talked about the next Mazzarell book. Is there anything further you'd like to talk about in terms of future plans for either one of you?
Well, you want to talk about San Francisco, Gary, and generally?
Well, the pandemic has made it very difficult to do research, but now things are opening up again. I have often thought that maybe at some point I will return to writing fiction. The last fiction I wrote was in 2002. And I've been very happily doing narrative nonfiction since then. But there is a certain fiction itch that I may want to scratch again. So after the San Francisco book, there may be a novel in my future, but I'm not sure.
Nice. And as I mentioned, I'm working on a couple of screenplays on the original talk about pandemic. On the original pandemic, one of them is smallpox. So, and it was the team that went out trying to successfully battle what is in fact the world's deadliest disease. Killed 300 million people in the last century. Kind of puts COVID in perspective.
All right. I think we've pretty much come to the end of our time. We certainly appreciate you taking the time to speak with us. This has been a terrific session, and I know on behalf of all of our attendees that I'll speak for them freely, that we all enjoyed this very much. You had some very nice comments that came in from some of the folks that were on about how great this is. We will be announcing soon our next number in our series. It's scheduled tentatively for April, and so watch for announcements for that soon. And this particular session, along with all of our previous sessions, will be available on YouTube within the next day or so. We'll post this up on the Princeton 1979 channel on YouTube, where all of our authors and artists are. In fact, you guys are already well represented on there. I know this is the second one for both of you, and we really do appreciate your time. And thanks again.
Thank you.